I'm very pleased to be here today with Conrad Pope, who I think I can arguably call the Dean of Hollywood orchestrators. He's done as much to define what this craft is as people like Billy May and Nelson Riddle did in the age of jazz standards, as much as someone like Jonathan Tunick has done on Broadway. The sound of film music as we know it today, due to his efforts over the last, 30 years, Conrad?
35 years.
35 years. And during that time, he's orchestrated over 150 films and served as a musician on over 400. And speaking of people who've been around for a long time, when guys like you and me, who've been in this business for a while, survey the state of the industry, the battlefield that's out there, we tend to do so with a sense of nostalgia for things that maybe we feel have been irretrievably lost. You hear people lamenting this all the time because pencil never hits paper anymore, because tape never hits tape head anymore, because the scores have to be composed much too quickly, so there's not adequate time for thought and conception. So these are all things that we somehow feel it might be difficult to get back. But as educators, when we're up in front of a group of aspiring young composers, we don't really want to tell them about what they don't have. We don't want to say that you're going into battle with a hand tied behind your back. So I try to turn this around and say, okay, this is the legacy. This is what was done. These are all the seeds that were sown long before you were born. You're now the stewards of that legacy. You're now the people carrying the embers of that fire from camp to camp. So what I want to start off talking about a little bit are the things we don't want to lose. Things that you've witnessed over your time of working with some of the greatest figures in this business, that we might be in danger if we don't take care of them, if we don't shepherd them, of losing at some point. So why don't you, just if you can, create a little shopping list for me of the things we don't want to let go of.
Well, I think the first thing we don't want to let go of is that you should do this if you love music and love film and love storytelling, and that you get great satisfaction in being able to set the scene with a drama that's going to touch people, either call them to action or know something about love or any of the many things that cinema does, because that's what storytelling is. It's a way of us experiencing the past, the future, and the present. And those are the major things, is that you have to have a love of communicating with people, reaching out and touching them. And that means you have to be able to be touched. And so this is a thing of where all the barriers should come down, that this is a very honest business. And that's the first thing, is to be honest with yourself and honest with your audience. And there you need to have certain skills. I know that we're nostalgic for the past, but we always will. And like I said, is that music used to be something that only existed in the present, if you think about it, before recordings. And so there was this sense of the impermanence of it, if you know, that you go to a concert and that concert would be in the past, and it was only in the present. And if I could say one thing about, I tend to tell students, as musicians, we're actually the custodians for the time we're in music, however long that is, either for a short life or a long life. But nonetheless, when we're custodians of music, I just sort of view us all in the same time frame as Beethoven. I view him as a contemporary, because as musicians, I think we're all about 12 years old. We still have that sense of wonder. We have that sense of hope. We have that sense of how you can be open to many emotions, and you think love is always fresh, tragedy is always profound. Things when you're a kid, that's how we are as people. And so if we can keep that idea of that we want to be the best musicians we can be, just in terms of how we perform on an instrument, how we write music, and that we're open to new music and other voices, and that we're aware of the music around us as well as the music inside us. Those are the real things that will keep this always fresh, because the past, sadly, will remain the past. And we're always amazed that when you learn more about the past, how it even looks like today. Because today, people might say, well, there's not the single composer in Hollywood. There's the composer, and then he has a team of assistants. That's always been true in this business from the very earliest days. The teams were for even Max Steiner or Korngold. Now, with Korngold, I don't think they wrote too much music, but with Steiner, say, Hugo Friedhofer actually wrote the opening for Gone with the Wind, and most people don't know that. So this has always been a collaborative effort among people who were like-minded, shared certain values, had certain backgrounds. And those are the most important things to keep with all of us, with the students, is to try to pass on our experiences, our sense of comradeship, as well as sympathy for our fellow professionals, our respect for even our competitors, and also being able to realize great work when we see it, and to realize that this is a community, and that we work better when we cooperate, and we work better when we keep our ears open and our minds open about things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, despite their reputation, no film composer, screen composer is really a lone gun, right? There is a team. Now, in the very beginning of their career, they may well have to do everything.
Absolutely.
But once they establish some level of professional success, they're going to start to bring in partners. And you are, now at this point, you started out copying music, right?
No, I was never a good enough copyist, actually. When I first came, I actually started out by doing what they call transcriptions. And actually, I was writing some music for theater X, Y, and Z. Well, from the transcriptions, because I could do the transcriptions, that led to me working in a copying office where Joanne Kane at 20th Century Fox, I won't go into the whole story, but I ended up there basically doing transcriptions and proofreading because my hand wasn't quite good enough for the copyist, because again, that's a very special skill that is underappreciated of what it means to be able to sort of split a line in 4 equal pieces and have a bar here and have these beautiful note heads and all this kind of stuff. So I looked at other people's copying and tried to compare what they were doing with scores or sketches. And then when they had to have sound-alikes, I would be sent off to do a sound-alike. I'd be sent over to the Fox stage where there was a piano that I could work at and come back. But yes, I got into the business working in a place that had the very finest composers in the business coming through there so I could see their work, like John Williams and Jerry Goldsmith. And even people that were not nearly as accomplished. I got to see the other end of the spectrum too, because music is a spectrum. Wish it was all high, but there's also that stuff that's low. And so you can, if you have the right attitude, like I tell students, certainly you can learn from the best, but you can also learn from the worst, because it's as important to know what to do and it's important to know what not to do and what causes problems.
Yeah. So you were doing takedowns.
That's right.
And a skill which has probably served you well over the years. In those days, it was probably a matter of time frame, deadlines, things like that.
Yes.
Today, it might well be because you're delivered, a bunch of, MIDI files.
Yes, I mean, my assistant, Bill Newland, he's the master of now takedowns. He's a very skilled copyist, synthesist, knows all the programs. This is what people need to know today. And he's just expert at this all. And I won't even mention the composers he's worked for, but many composers today simply deliver Pro Tool files.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first started my career, I was doing MIDI transcriptions because in those days, there was, if you saw the event list, there were no notes. It was just a bunch of numbers. So I'd get a cassette tape of somebody's work that was synthesized, and then I'd have to try to take it down and make a sketch that looked more like, say, a composer's sketch. And sometimes you had to guess because we didn't have all the data. And so, yes, it served me very well, but it was the thing that got me into the business. Because as I tell young people, they may not need a composer, but if you have a skill, that will help you break down a door and at least get your foot in the door so that people can realize you're dependable, you're accurate, you take things to heart, and it shows that you have some skill, and that allows them to discover perhaps other skills you might have.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of those MIDI files and Pro Tools sessions, do you think, has it been your experience that musical literacy, both in the sense of the ability to notate what you conceive and also just awareness of the repertoire, of the body of music that's out there. Has that dipped in recent decades among particularly among the younger composers you work with? Do you sense that it's become possible to be functionally illiterate and still survive and even have a good career in this business? But have you seen a notable decrease
Well, I
in
think it's
literacy?
well, I think that it's probably a numbers game, because if you go back to say the 80s, when I first came to Hollywood, I came to Hollywood, I guess, in 1987. In any case, at that particular time, synthesis was not that advanced. That basically it was still a paper and pencil business. The keys to the kingdom was to be able to sit at a table and write music, say without a piano, or sit at a piano and write music, and then have it show up on the stage and have it played down with no mistakes, and it would all sound brilliant, and it would be this and that. Now, that kind of being comfortable with pen and pencil comes from an education where you've learned to play the piano, you've learned to hear in the piano music, you've score read, you have a lot of experience either with writing for, in those days, some were like big band writers and some were orchestral writers. You mentioned Nelson Riddle and Billy May, they learned on the job with a band. And so you need to have some experience of live music. And so I would say probably is 50-50 in those days, because there's always been, if you talk to the old timers, there have always been what we used to call hummers. In fact, I worked for a hummer once. And I just remember I was sent over there to say, this guy's going to sing for you his score. And I remember he started singing his score. And sadly, he wasn't even much of a hummer, because there was no musical shape to anything he did. It was like, ma, 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 ma. He had great emotion, and he could scream and he could whisper. And I just thought, well, I'll make something up. And they seemed happy with it. But nonetheless, is that kind of musical illiteracy has always existed, as well as hyperliteracy, like some of the great composers like John Will. But generally, back in the 80s, you had to strike a balance, because you couldn't get into the studios unless you proved your competence at being able pencil and paper. That changed as electronics and computers became better. And I would say today that probably the hyper-literate end of the spectrum is probably more 10%. I'd say so many young people that are in film music or in film music because of film music. And not that that's surprising, as I tend to tell people, I did not grow up in a musical family. And so probably the first symphonic music I heard was in the theater. And so it's not surprising that I grew up, hearing Schoenberg, but it wasn't Schoenberg. It was a German composer thinking that that kind of music would scare people. And then I would hear these sort of big, elaborate, what they call them, sand and sandal epics on the biblical stuff. And so in a way, everybody now grows up with that symphonic tradition. And what I've noticed is that I was trained in classical music, and I also did jazz as a kid and this kind of thing, not at a very high level. But nonetheless, I was exposed to all this stuff in American culture, rock and roll and all the rest. And so today I would say that when I teach students, I'm always struck by how many the reference is really movies and movie music. And what's encouraging about that is that, in a way, movie music has a much greater swath of styles and approaches and personalities in it. And so when you meet somebody, they might not know Bartok, but what they will know is perhaps even more styles. And also, that said, now with the computer, people can play and do many things by ear. And that's a very special gift, I think. And I sometimes value that more than people that can read. But nonetheless, I still have students come to me like, well, Mr. Pope, do I really have to know counterpoint, or do I have to be able to read music? And I generally ask them how old they are. And in one case, I remember a young man said I was 18. And like I said at that time, I wish when I was 18 I could ask people what I didn't have to know.
Right. I mean, not to get stuck on this issue of literacy, but I do think it's important to touch on it, because I've seen composers, some quite well known, proclaim in various online forums and so forth that reading music is overrated, that it's really not an essential skill anymore. Now, as someone who was ear trained and who actually did not learn to read a score until I was in my 30s. And I did it because I was working with people like Elmer Bernstein, who were willing to allow me to have my say, but not if I couldn't understand what he'd written. What do you think, is it still an essential skill, and why?
I think if you want to make music at a very high level, or even for yourself, I think that it is important, because I think musical literacy is like any kind of literacy. To acquire the skills of literacy, you actually learn the skills of form. You're able to understand why this starts out with just a solo instrument and builds, and you can look at how the music is constructed. John Williams is somebody that clearly has a great command, not only the literature of the past, and has performed. A friend of mine was telling me, John used to even just accompany singers in Leader, and he still plays. And I think that that is one of those things. It depends on how you engage music. We all come to it differently, and there isn't just a single path into it. For me, I was very committed from a very early age. I learned to read scores by going to the library, and I was in the little town I lived in. What was amazing, somebody gifted the library. They died, and they had this magnificent music library that they gave to our local library that included theory books as well as scores from every composer seemed imaginable. And so I started going to the library and checking those out and trying to score read. And so I've got a different engagement than, say, somebody that comes to music quite late. When I was teaching, because my first jobs, they were not in Hollywood. I was a teacher at Brandeis University. One of my students didn't come to music until he was 17 years old, and had suffered a skiing accident, and he was on the Olympic skiing team. And he had that sort of Olympian thing of that once he had broken his leg, he wasn't going to be in the Olympic skiing team. And so he turned his energy, he played guitar, and this day he is actually the chairman of music at a very prestigious university. And he's also performed by major orchestras now as a composer. So I think that it's very possible, particularly today with computers, you can come to music at a very late age. And what I tell people is that what I'm excited by in that particular case is that we're inviting people to make music that maybe would not have. Because if you don't grow up in a family that supports music education when you're very young, you might be excluded from doing music until today.
Right.
And today we're having people that still have imaginations, feelings, that have access to make music through means that in the past you had to sort of start when you were pretty young in order to have the skills when you were older to participate. And so I find that exciting. I think that young people have to think about that. But I will not forgive people. Come to music, but be hungry for it. Be starved for it. And try to find out as much as you can about every style of music as you can. And I think that that's why I say you're invited. But, as somebody told me once when I first came to Hollywood, a music editor friend of mine, she said, here in Hollywood, we need everything from the symphonic orchestra to somebody that finds out how to blow on a Coke bottle to make a score. And that's still true.
Yeah.
All kinds of talents and all kinds of approaches are welcomed if they serve the picture and the drama.
I think the democratizing of the arts is kind of the story of our times. We may be inviting some people to make music who shouldn't be making music, but that's another subject.
That's always been the case.
Yeah. To the student who asked you whether it was important to know counterpoint, I want to know what you think about this. When you actually ask a student, even somebody who is purportedly at a fairly advanced level, maybe been through 4 years of undergraduate training either in music performance or composition, when you ask them to sit down and write species counterpoint, simple punta contra punta, note against note counterpoint, it's remarkable how many people have serious difficulty with that, with the thought process that requires. Okay, something like voice leading, for example. Now, it is true that you can get by these days and call yourself a film composer without knowing much beyond sort of an intuitive sense of what works and what doesn't. But I do think that might be one of those things that we need to preserve, we need to hold on to.
I know, I agree. And I think that with counterpoint, I mean, just my own thing about species counterpoint, I sometimes think that one of the problems in universities is that you take people that have no sense of harmony and you teach them this very abstract kind of species counterpoint is more like almost a metaphor or an allegory, if you will, for consonance and dissonance because it's so sterile in an odd way that not until you've actually experienced music, say with Bach chorales, I would say that, at least these are chords and you can sing them and you learn voice leading, that then you can see the abstraction species counterpoint is, as opposed to, it's not very helpful until you can move a lot of notes around. And what I'd say about voice leading is that voice leading, follow why it's called that. It's very important to sing music. If you're a pianist, you can just sort of plop your hands down and play a bunch of things. But when I teach orchestration, I always tell people, look, you're not writing for a cello, you're writing for a cellist. You're writing for somebody that sings their instrument. They sing their music. And so if you can learn to sing the music that you're making, the melodies and maybe the inner parts, feel it and feel the movement. Get away from just the responding to the sound the computer gives you. But we all have to be performers in a certain sense. And I don't care if that performance is dancing your own music or doing it, but you have to sort of internalize it, make part of your rhythm, make it something that you make. And that will keep you on the straight and narrow more than anything else. It's when you start thinking abstractly and thinking that this is a puzzle
Right,
to be solved.
right.
And the computer can invite that, sadly. And
It can. And I've heard many people say if you can't sing your principal line, it's probably not going to work. Now, I don't know how that would apply to a 12-tone row. For example, obviously there are some lines that are easier to vocalize than others. But the human voice really is the origin of all of it,
oh,
right?
yes.
Before there was a single, piece of bamboo bored out to create a flute of some kind, there was that. And if you go back to that in composition, it seems to me you're resting on a fairly firm foundation. And it is so easy to evade that with, with the DAW.
With the dawn, well, I think the thing is that we keep thinking that we're writing for an audience. And I try to tell students, you're writing for other musicians first, actually. And so you have to write something that musicians can absorb, that are performing musicians, that they want to play. And I think you're absolutely right. The first instrument was the voice and maybe the hands and rhythm. And between those things, that music is either singing or dancing. If you can get these sorts of things in you, sort of like even with film music, that there are these moments like when the couple falls in love, that the music soars and sings, or when there's a car chase, that the music is dancing, if you will, with that sort of physical, visceral energy. You have to have both that sense of ecstasy and this almost church-like music. And you also have to have that almost primitive sense of what it really means to thump and dance and feel that energy. Because music is a combination of those things, and those were the earliest impulses. And just like one can scream, that's not very effective in vocal music because we all know it's just a scream. But what's great is that once the instruments started to take over and instrumental music happened, we found ways of trying to convey that same energy and that same fright that, say, a screaming might have in notes and in various instruments and in orchestration, if you will. And so, but the basic thing has to be, as I tell students, music's harder than you think, but simpler than you think. And the thing is, people get hung up on how hard it is rather than trying to get it to as simple as it can be. And I try to tell people, as my composition teacher at the Hochschule in Munich once said, is that he said, music must be einfach, aber nicht simple, just meaning as simple as it can be, but not simple-minded.
Right.
And I think that as long as, no matter what age you are when you come to this, if you can just keep that kind of primitive sense about it, because as I also tell students, I think when Beethoven was walking in the hills around Vienna or around Baden, where his summer home was, is that he wasn't necessarily working out his 12-tone row. It wasn't necessarily an intellectual exercise. It was an internalization of the rhythm of the piece, this power of the piece, and what he had to deliver.
Right. The origin of almost every great symphonic piece is somebody whistling, as they take a walk in the park. People understood, if students understood how humble the origins of even something like the Rite of Spring are, they wouldn't be so intimidated by it.
That's right.
They hear the final product and they think, I could never do that, not in a million years. And they don't realize it began with somebody banging, a tritone out on a piano. It all starts in this, and you're right, especially in film, music is an analog of emotion, of story values. And I've had students, I had one student with 3 master's degrees and 2 doctorates, all in music, who was asked to underscore a scene where there was a conflict going on between a couple, between a man and a woman. And she could not get inside the scene. She could not get behind the story. She had to ride over the top of it because that was her training. And that's a really important thing, don't you think? I mean, you mentioned this at the top. You have the desire to be a storyteller is really kind of first and foremost, right?
I would say so, particularly if you want to be in film music.
Yeah.
I think it's also important in concert music to a degree. However, I can also say that I understand composers that are completely abstract in how they sort of approach things. Even if it is a puzzle, it's amazing that they still have these instincts to make it still effective, even though they're not born storytellers. Most of us have grown up on media. And certainly people of our generation were maybe the first to grow up surrounded by television and all this media and records and stuff, that we've all been trained to realize this. Thalberg once said, and when you used to walk into the studio at Sony, in those days, MGM, there was this picture of one of the old orchestras from the 40s, and underneath it said, "There's never been a silent film." Irving Thalberg.
Right.
And he meant that, like I've tried to say, is that, trust me, if silent films had actually been silent, we wouldn't even have film.
Yeah.
Because without the music to sort of touch your emotions, because I always point out, you can close your eyes at the cinema, but not your ears. And that if you've got your ears open, you can generally tell what the story is and also the impact of it from the music if it's well done. With that said, I think if you don't have an impulse to tell a story with music, there's plenty of other kinds of music you can do. Whether or not it's songwriting, those songwriters are the ultimate storytellers in ways.
Well, you work with Trent Reznor.
Yes, and Atticus
he
Ross.
seems to have made this transition fairly successfully. I have no idea what his method is, but it's earned him plaudits from the very beginning. And I would assume a lot of that has to do not just with the fact that he was a star, of a sort, that he had the juice, the charisma to attract the attention of studio executives and music supervisors, but because he had to learn that kind of storytelling as a songwriter.
And both Trent and Atticus in their scores, sure, they're Nine Inch Nails and they're mega stars, and they told stories with their songs and all this stuff. My First Wife is their favorite band, but working with them, is that what you find is that they actually are men that know the heart of the story, have great identification with the characters in the story, and they're able to write music that's empathetic and draws you in to understand the characters and their emotions and feel on screen with the characters that you've got.
Right.
And I don't care if it's one of the films I did with him was Mank and Bones and All, and something I didn't do with him just recently, they did Empire of Light. And you're just drawn into the characters. So yes, these men, that's almost the key to being successful and why directors would want you, is that the music, the characters have that music in them, and it's more like the composer releases the music in the character. And if you can have that kind of gift as they do, people will want you to score their film.
And they're probably not nearly as dark and twisted as the Nine Inch Nails music would lead you to believe, right?
Well, no, they're not as they're family men and they got kids and they got houses and they're great people.
Yeah,
That's the truth.
it always struck me that Randy Newman was probably the world's most natural film composer because he always wrote as a character.
Yes.
All of his songwriting is written from the perspective of sometimes some pretty odd characters. And that is kind of what you have to do if you're trying to create a leitmotif or a theme for a character, and particularly if that character is a little bit bent. You have to be able to get inside that head, right?
I think that, yes, I think because you have to sort of think like an opera. I think that that's the problem with, a really great film composer has the ability to be kind of an actor, inhabit the characters individually. They also have to have the talent to understand the structure of the story as a storyteller, as the author as well. So you have to be part playwright, understand the mechanics of how you get your point across in plotting, because you have to plot a film score. And then you also have to inhabit the character. And that's what I think makes film scoring so exciting, because some of us can be characters, but we can't get the plotting, so we have to study plotting, and others of us. But the really great composers, they have to have that kind of immersive thing in the story itself and the drama of it, and they have to want to deliver it. And that's where, again, if you're an academic composer or a composer for whom music is an abstraction and a series of relationships and formal things, this might not be the profession for you. This is a profession where you're called upon to not only to sing and to understand and almost be a philosopher. It's a great invitation to make yourself a better person, actually. And that's the great gift of working in film music, because you get to have so many stories that deal with psychos to funny people, from children to dinosaurs. And
yeah,
so,
not every member of the crew of that great collaborative enterprise that creates motion pictures needs to understand the whole picture, but the composer does. And I would assume the orchestrator does as well, particularly because you're sort of coming in the end game.
well, an orchestrator, I think that we're more technical. We're not called, no one asks us what we think of the story. But what we do have to understand in ways is that it's good to understand the drama. And many of the composers I work for want to be sure that I've seen the picture and that I understand the drama. But then again, we get into the other side of this business, which is that it is highly technical, and that you have to, the orchestrator, even more than the composer, maybe not more, but as much as the composer, has to understand that the music, particularly in today's world, is just part of a soundscape.
Right.
Because we've also gotten used to sound design, which has become also very emotional. I think many composers would make excellent sound designers, and vice versa. Sound designers have to think like composers. And so now there's this new marriage of where all these people have to meet. But as a composer, I would say, just as a person, it's like Patrick Doyle. I understand that he began as an actor. I don't know Patrick, never talked to him.
That's right.
But I see how being an actor is the perfect training for being open to know how to experience a film, and then if that resonates in something inside you, how you could express it.
In fact, he was an extra on Kenneth Branagh's Henry V. He was a spear carrier. Patrick is diminutive. He's not a tall spear carrier. So he was out there in the ranks somewhere when somebody whispered in Ken Branagh's ear that he was going to need a composer fairly soon. Oh, really? I need one of those? I can't just do what Stanley Kubrick did?
Yeah.
And he got on his megaphone and asked if anybody out there knew how to write music. And Patrick, this is the story he tells, put his spear in the air and said, I do.
That's a fantastic story. I love it.
I want to dip into something with you that's a little, you said composers have to be philosophers to some extent. This is a little bit more philosophical, but I think it goes sort of to the heart of the matter of what young composers are dealing with today. Now, as you've learned, most of the people you've been working with over the past week do not know a world without the internet. They don't know a world without the DAW. And I think I have this idea that everything virtual has some sort of in real life antecedent. Everything digital has some sort of analog antecedent. Before there were zeros and ones in a data stream, there were grains of ferrous oxide on a piece of recording tape. before there were pixels. There were, grains of silver
And
oxide
nitrate and all that
on the
stuff.
film,
Yeah, yeah.
all that kind of stuff. And you get a lot of people these days saying, well, why do I need to know that parts were once copied out by hand? When essentially this is a task, the extraction of parts is a task performed with keystrokes, if you're using Finale or Sibelius or Dorico. And what I think the reason they need to know has to do with attention. You know that when you make a mental note, it doesn't have the same kind of staying power as making a note. Make a mental note, it's going to be, the tide is going to sweep it out. But if there's this little Post-it sitting on your desk, right, you're more likely to actually do this thing. Now, somebody copying out parts by hand is going to be proofing them as they copy. They're going to be looking not just for mistakes, and it seems to me this is why it's so important for young composers to know that there are these antecedents for what they now view as an automated process. Because most of the mistakes I see in the work have to do with an absence of attention.
Well, no, I would agree. I mean, it's one of those things that if you're of some religious bent, some people will tell you the first commandment is actually pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
Pay attention to life, pay attention to God, pay all this stuff. And I will just simply say this again: we're moving away from this because I read, but I'm not a psychiatrist or a scientist. But I do understand that our hands, that even when you have children, it's very important to play ball with them. And if you even think about conducting, and that the speed at which you move your hands and how we respond, is that you can learn a lot about conducting just playing with a ball.
Mm-hmm.
And that teaches you something about rhythm and other things. Also, we learn through our hands. And so when we learn to make a note, like I was taught, you have to think the note, you have to hear the note, you have to know where it is. And in that moment that you're doing this, the hand is talking to your brain, and there's this communication between your connection directly to that thing. And it's maybe artificial because we still have the pencil, and somebody would say this keystroke is the same, but it's not the same because you can sort of input a bunch of things. But I think that sense of attention and knowing and do everything with intentionality.
Mm-hmm.
As my assistant tells me, because when I do the computer, he goes, do that with attention. He's always reminding me because we find it so easy to go keystroke, keystroke, keystroke. Once I was doing a student film when I first came to Hollywood, and I had this Kurzweil K250, and I thought that was the king of instruments. And in those days, you didn't have a DAW, but the Kurzweil would actually record everything. You have your score.
Right.
And I remember I got very fast at hitting all these buttons, and I had to deliver a score to a student film the next day, and I was finishing up the last cue. And with the Kurzweil, if you hit the buttons in a certain sequence, this thing would come out, are you sure you want to reset the instrument? And before I could stop myself, I said yes, wiped out the entire score.
Right.
So in any case, that's not paying attention. And at times we tend to think that the computer is smarter than we are. But the fact of the matter is that, again, with the reason I like still writing by hand is I feel engaged with the music. And it also, there's an aspect, when you see a piece of music paper, if you know how to fill that in, it invites ideas. And I also tend to think what worries me more about the computer is that we're becoming performance artists. In other words, before we commit to an idea, we have to hear it back at us. And we're always, rather than sort of living with it and in silence, like I try to tell the kids, come up with your ideas in silence, because you have to, maybe there's a musical voice that will come into your brain that you didn't expect. And I just worry that at times we're becoming improvisers as opposed to letting the ideas sort of gestate inside us and come naturally in silence, because to me that's one of the miracles of music, is that it's something, certainly with people my age, that we love our imaginations. And we love trying to, or maybe that's self-serving, is that we like the idea that we can think of various possibilities and then something occurs to us in silence. And then it becomes sound. It goes from in here to out there. And then with the performers, it's the exact opposite, is that they see the symbols, then they hear it, and it goes inside there. And
Yeah.
there's a kind of dialogue.
I agree. Physical processes anchor mental processes. So the process of putting a note on a page is meaningful in a way that playing a note in is not. It's not quite the same thing. And this is where, and I don't want to be one of these old guys
I know.
who says, "Why, when I was a boy, we did it this way." But I think there is, for example, if you take the idea of laying out a score, for example, when you've got a composer and he's got the film on a moviola or something like that,
Yes.
or a flatbed editor, and he's breaking down this thing. He's figuring out tempi, meter, and so forth in order to plot his hits, the things that he needs to catch. And this is going down, back in the day, basically it's going down on sketch or score paper. And particularly if you have these pages sort of laid one against the other, you're actually looking at the breadth of this thing. And you're thinking more like a symphonic, like a concert composer does, in the sense that this event here is going to need to make this event here make sense.
Exactly, and that's what I'm afraid we've lost. Look, I've been in this business a very long time, and I remember what I loved about working with James Horner when I was orchestrating for him, is that even on Troy, we used to get these things called timing notes.
Mm-hmm.
That you would go and view the film, and you would spot the picture with the composer, with the director, I should say, and you would break down the scenes and sort of know that this was important, that was important, and X, Y, and Z. Then the music editor, you knew what the scenes were, and you might have the film on the moviola. But what would happen is that the music editor, and music editors no longer do this, frankly, the music editor had to also be a dramatist. That's why it paid to have a team of somebody that you knew that also understood film like you did. The music editor would then sort of break down the scene with the dialogue and put the timings in the thing, and you would be able to sort of see the structure over like 3 minutes of the entire scene, and you would know that you were going to hit maybe two things. Then you would plot out the cue, as we would, over, in my case, I'd first plot it out on like a 4-line stave thing, where I would mark on, this is an important moment, this is an important moment, and I would be knowing I had to get there. And I had to go away, and then I had to get there, and then I had to acknowledge this. So I'd see the structure of the entire scene before I began. More importantly, I would be not so much looking at it as internalizing what I'd seen by the words that the music editor, a good music editor was almost like a journalist.
Right.
They would know the exact sort of emotional word that would say, this sums up this scene just like this. And so they even had to be masters of a kind of language. And so there was this sort of process in the old days of where everybody was just in trying to find the right word to describe that look, and that would communicate to you again in silence. And you would write the cue, basically replaying it in your head, occasionally maybe referencing the film, but primarily looking at the scoring notes. And so in a way, you were writing the music much like the script writer had written the script.
Right.
Who is just but you're still playing it in your head. And so today what happens, or can happen, is that people just, and I'm as guilty as the next person, because the technology is quite seductive to thinking it's a shortcut to just simply do a quick time of the film, look at it, and just bop along with it. And the trouble with that, as far as drama goes, I would say that you learn is that, and Americans have always been guilty of this, it becomes more cartoon. You're invited to sort of acknowledge every little thing, and the music does X, Y, and Z.
Exactly. The very thing we were trying to get away from in our craft, which is Mickey Mousing, is actually reinforced because when we're in the DAW, we're like this.
Yes,
and we're moving from bar to bar. We're seeing at most an expanse of 10 bars or something like that on the screen in front of us. And it's not that these people are not capable creatively, artistically, of anticipating what's going to happen after you move on to the next 10 bars. They know that a climax or a significant event is coming.
Yes.
But it's the DAW encourages a process that is more fragmentary. And
I think so. I mean, with rare exceptions. I just happen to think that this old discipline that I was saying is that because it, like you were saying, it's like a concert composer, is that, and like I was telling the class today, me when I'm writing something, or even when I'm orchestrating, depending on the people that I'm working for and what they need from me, I want to know at the end of the scene or at the climax of the scene, how do I want the audience to feel?
right.
And I'm always working towards that emotion. And I don't want to give it away too soon. I know that there's got to be a build. And I know that we've got to have a line across this because, again, as Hugo Friedhofer said, the magic of movies is that you've got a bunch of still pictures that are cut up, that are really assembled, and that the music is there to give the continuity of emotion across all these cuts and all these various frames. And the DAW at times, I just see people just reacting. And that also encourages, if sometimes, this is another thing, is that when you don't know what to do, you have people doing everything. That happened also on pencil and paper too. But again, I think the more that one can internalize it and feel it, that's the major thing, rather than feeling compelled to react. Because this is
Right.
not about reaction. This is about absorption and then finding a way to express what's really there.
You nailed it. It's the flaw. The fly in the ointment is that music has become too reactive. I think that's right. I think that the DAW is a marvelous tool. And the instant gratification it provides, by the way, it's like, wow, did I write that?
Yes, exactly.
And it's probably also, given the way directors and showrunners and so forth like to work these days, it's now an essential tool. We have to be able to shoot these, what we used to call Polaroids,
Yeah.
and show the director what our intentions are before we expect him to sign off on the cue. But I do think, and this is one of those things that we can encourage young composers to do, that it's not the old guys, compelling you. It's not an old school versus new school
No.
thing. It's about composition. They say that Bernard Herrmann wrote to the score. And he couldn't possibly have done that without having envisioned how, first of all, knowing the scene like the back of his own hand, and then understanding this is not a matter of pulling out Symphobia and doing a rise and hit. Because if that's all you do, I mean, anybody now with a DAW can hit anything.
That's right.
But to actually earn it over the course of 30 or 40 seconds, so when that moment, when that hit comes, it feels absolutely right. That takes this breadth, right?
And know that, that again, the movie itself is already moving at a certain speed. And I think that what you want to do is be able to pace yourself, like you're saying with Bernard Herrmann. And a love theme, like I would say, it's that old thing about writing. In a love story, it's not that the two people are in love. That's not what's interesting. What's interesting is what keeps them apart. And in music, it isn't that the climax, the rise, it's how it gets there. That is the thing that draws you through the scene. And so it's that creation of tension. That's the most important thing, rather than the delivery of, now, because we know that that's going to happen, but how you get there is the real journey. And again, I just happen to think that this is something that has to be internalized, because again, the DAW, you react. And not that there's anything wrong with it. Conversely, I'll also say this. I think it's also affected directors. And this is a larger, almost cultural question going back to the beginning. I fear that, at least in California, unless you're with a magnet school, say, music used to be part of the education from everybody from the first grade forward. There was some way everybody had to learn to sing songs, sort of learn to read some music. You didn't have to be great at it, but there was a sense of that music was special. And for a child to see this other language, I know even for me, I think part of the fascination with music came with the idea that there are these symbols and this other abstract language and something that, how is it that this thing, the dots and everything, moves me so deeply? Why is it that I have the same emotion in listening to this score as a pianist that the guy that is the janitor has too? That there's this commune, the communal sense of that. That's also what's great about film music, is that it's not class conscious. It's about who we are as people and what we value. And my great fear in terms of our education, even with directors, because they're artists too, I've noticed with directors at times the lack of, with music out of the school system, out of our society, fewer people going to church or synagogue, where music does play a role in this extra way. Like I've said, I'm not sure if there is a God, but I will say He has a voice, that speaks to all of us. That's what I fear, is that we've lost the ability for music to touch us. I saw a recent documentary about a film composer in which a very famous film director basically said what he liked about this score was that it's perfect to the film. And in a way that we say that the film must dictate the music, but in a way, the film should be almost this other dimension of the music to me. That if it only reflects what the film does, it's just reinforcing these images as opposed to reinforcing the emotion, the motivation, what the characters are feeling, what makes them do this, and how you feel once they've done
Yeah,
things.
if it's a well-made film, there is always a subtext.
Yes,
And I always
exactly.
think of music, the underscore, as being like kind of like the footlights, as if there's this glow coming from beneath the screen. The audience isn't really all that aware of it, but it's there and it's illuminating the events on screen. And the music is those footlights. It's finding its way to the things unsaid, unseen, etc. That, and half the time the directors aren't even aware that those things are there until the composer shows them that they are.
Yeah, and I think that whenever you see a silent film, I mean, it's amazing what music does. I mean, and there are numbers of this, but I think you're absolutely right, because there's this old saw that, oh, a good film score shouldn't be heard. What's really meant by that is that you should not be aware of it, because you should not hear it, you should feel it. And that when it's really in sync with the film, it's like riding a horse, is that if you're in sync with the horse, you're with the horse.
Right.
And you're not aware of it. If you're not in sync with the horse, then you're going to be very sore when you dismount. And a really great film score is so wedded to the images and the emotion and the pace of the story. Again, what you do with the DAW that always distressed me is that when I was when I was learning the business, it was that I learned that editors have a pacing to how they pace the scene, and that really the first thing you should do is know what the pace is and the tempo. And I think that really the right tempo, like I tell students, believe it or not, if you got a metronome, it's really within 3 to 5 BPM. Either side, maybe that's even too much. But you should try to actually find the rhythm of the scene. And the way to find the rhythm of the scene is to watch it over and over and move with it. Engage with it with your body, for me. And then I put the tempo in the DAW, so to speak.
Right.
As opposed to one composer I looked at, he always found the rhythm of the scene, but the tempos were always 120. So even the simplest music looked like a score of Stockhausen. But I think that again, this is simpler than you think and harder than you think. But the more that you can get into the film yourself and have it become part of you, the better the score will be. And even as an orchestrator, the better the orchestration will be, the better everything will be.
I think the horse metaphor is great. And I'm going to use that,
Please
if you don't
do.
mind, because almost nobody gets that right the first time. In fact, you have to go home with a sore ass many, many times before you finally get that rhythm.
That's right.
And because you're essentially trying to impose something from outside the animal, your will,
That's right.
on this thing that will not succumb to your will. They'll let you hold the reins, they'll take the bit, but ultimately it's their ride. And you have to find that, right?
Exactly, because otherwise, But also, if you've ever ridden a horse, you'll know that even saddling them is a thing because they want you off. And so they bloat themselves up when you put the saddle on. And then you get out on the trail, they let it out and you fall off the saddle. But the idea of that you're one with this thing that has its own rhythm, its own sense of what it is, and you have to become that as opposed to trying to impose something on it. And I think that's one of the hardest things, like I tell composers, is that you almost have to be in a Zen state because young people, and directors too, I mean, I've got to say, having worked on a number of projects where you bring in music and you have producers and directors thinking when they hear the music, they're not really trying to experience the music with the film. They've got this little thing of, what do I think? What do I think? They're more self-conscious about, what do I think? What am I going to say? What does this mean? Do I like this? Is this working? And they have this interior dialogue as opposed to almost becoming empty and then trying to experience as we do as an audience, because none of us as an audience ever walk in going like, what am I thinking? Am I going to like it? Have I read the criticism? Blah, 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 blah. Everybody's just there to experience. And so one of the great things that you have to cultivate in yourself, and I can say this from from a personal experience. I was doing something for DreamWorks once, and Steven Spielberg was the executive producer. And when Steven saw the stuff, he was the only person on the team that experienced it as the audience. In other words, he was always a virgin to the process. And to be able to have that sense of virginity and keep that fresh is probably the key to being a really fine filmmaker and fine film composer. To empty yourself of the sickness of that being a judge and jury is that, as they say about test audiences, the trouble with test audiences is that they think they have to come up with a verdict.
Right. Conrad, this is one of the things I miss about California. I don't think I ever had a business lunch with anyone, even the most hard-boiled agent or executive, that didn't at some point compare or relate whatever business issue is being discussed to some sort of spiritual or personal issue. And you mentioned this sort of Zen state. I want to close this first session by going back to something you said before about silence. So, back in the audiophile days, we used to evaluate audio components based on their signal-to-noise ratio.
Yes.
Right? Life today has a really crappy signal-to-noise ratio.
Gotta agree.
For these, Andy. Especially for these young composers who are thinking about, their image, their website, how much networking they did today, how many emails they sent out, and they're also being jacked up by all these incredible libraries, which essentially amateur musicians and hobbyists are cranking out week after week after week and taking our money for.
Yeah.
That it seems like there's almost no silence in their existence. And silence that's how you let the movie speak to you.
Yes.
Right? You can't, I don't know how it's possible to be creative without finding that quiet space from which ideas emerge.
No, I totally agree. Maybe it's old-fashioned, but I happen to think, again, like I said earlier, music's harder than you think and simpler than you think. And life, too, in a way, is that you have to not always be trying to impose your will upon reality. You have to, if you're in the movie business, you have to be open to let the film speak to you. And in a way that perhaps even the director doesn't know. Because oftentimes they're too scared themselves, particularly when you come in at post-production. But I think that's the real challenge today because we have so many wonderful toys, so many wonderful things that can distract us, and so many lies we can tell ourselves about the wonderful sounds that come out of the DAW, that you first have to say, that is a wonderful sound, but does it fit the picture?
Right.
And does it move me at this moment? And does it take me? Remember, you're always taking somebody on a journey. You're not sort of trying to sell soap with this hard sell. And sometimes cues can be that with the DAW.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't think it's particularly old-fashioned to say that if you're trying to write at 2 o'clock in the morning with the notifications on, so that every time somebody sends you an email or an SMS or anything like that, you're getting dinged. And I know some people actually do this, and they try to justify it as multitasking.
Yes.
But I think that's why probably so much of what we hear today tends to sound the same, because about the only thing you can do well when you're in that sort of fragmented state is imitate.
And the thing is, it's been encouraged. But though I will say, like in the certainly in my early part of the career, it's not the case today. But when I was orchestrating a great deal, I would start working at 3 o'clock in the morning because I knew I had about 6 hours of silence between 3 and 9 before the phone would start. And when you are working on one of these projects, certainly as an orchestrator, that's just frustrating as a composer, is that you're trying to have a work day, but there's no silence, there's only demands and questions. And so you have to find something. This is why composers either work very early in the morning or very late at night.
Right.
Because that's where they might find silence. But today, it's a 24-hour day, and you're right. I think that's the real challenge for all creative artists today, is to turn the notifications on and know that Facebook will be there tomorrow. But this opportunity for silence and to know yourself won't be.
We'll talk more the next time we get together about how to open up those periods of silence, even in the present age. But I think that's probably a good place to break today. Thank you, Conrad.
Thank
As
you, Andy.
always,
Yeah,
a whole heap of wisdom.
Yeah, it's great talking with you, Andy, and it's great talking about something we both love so much and want to see it continue on into the next generation.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you again soon.